In the aftermath of the Great War, the world yearned for peace. A new organization, the League of Nations, was born from this hope, a promise that diplomacy would forever replace bloodshed. But in 1935, this fragile promise was shattered, not in the heart of Europe, but in the highlands of Africa, in a conflict that would expose the League's fatal weakness and set the stage for an even greater war. This is the story of Ethiopia, Italy, and the war that revealed the League of Nations for what it truly was. Our story begins with two ambitious leaders. In Italy, Benito Mussolini. Il Duce dreamed of a new Roman Empire. He cast his eyes across the Mediterranean to Africa, where he sought to avenge a humiliating Italian defeat from decades earlier. In 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, an Italian army had been decisively crushed by Ethiopian forces. This wasn't just a military loss, it was a deep wound to Italian national pride. For Mussolini, conquering Ethiopia was about more than just territory. It was about restoring honor and projecting fascist power onto the world stage. On the other side was Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, also known as Abyssinia. He was a modernizer, a reformer, and a firm believer in the new international order. He had led his nation into the League of Nations in 1923, believing its principle of collective security would protect his ancient kingdom from foreign aggression. Ethiopia was one of the very few independent African nations, a symbol of black sovereignty in a world dominated by European colonial empires. Selassie put his faith in the promises made in Geneva, believing that the world's nations would stand together against an unprovoked attack. He was about to be tragically disappointed. The pretext for war came in December 1934 at a remote oasis called Wal, located in a disputed territory along the border between Ethiopia and Italian Somalia. A skirmish broke out between Ethiopian and Italian-led troops. Who fired first is still debated, but Mussolini didn't need a solid reason. He needed an excuse. He immediately painted Ethiopia as the aggressor and began a massive military buildup in his East African colonies of Eritrea and Somaliland. Haile Selassie knew his country was no match for a modern European army. Ethiopia's soldiers were brave and knew their land, but they were armed with outdated rifles, spears, and a few dozen antique cannons. Italy, on the other hand, was mobilizing hundreds of thousands of troops, equipped with modern artillery, tanks, and, most terrifyingly, an air force. Seeing the storm clouds gathering, Selassie did exactly what the League of Nations was designed for. He appealed to them, pleading for arbitration and intervention. He invoked Article 10 of the League's Covenant, which guaranteed the independence of member states. The world watched to see if this grand experiment in international cooperation would work. Would the League stand up to a major European power to defend a small African nation? The initial response from the League was slow and indecisive. The dominant powers, Britain and France, were in a difficult position. They were wary of Mussolini, but they saw him as a potential ally against a far greater threat, Adolf Hitler, as rapidly rearming Germany. They feared that if they pushed Mussolini too hard over Ethiopia, he would align himself completely with Hitler. This policy, which would become infamous as appeasement, guided their every move. Behind the scenes, Britain and France tried to find a compromise. The Horlaval Pacta Secret proposal, cooked up by their foreign ministers, offered to give Mussolini large parts of Ethiopia in exchange for him calling off the invasion. It was a classic Colonial era carve-up, completely ignoring Ethiopia's sovereignty. When the plan was leaked to the press, public outrage in Britain and France was so intense that the deal collapsed and the ministers were forced to resign. But the damage was done. The pact revealed that the major powers were willing to sacrifice a fellow League member for their own strategic interests. On October 3, 1935, without a formal declaration of war, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia from the north and south. Mussolini's generals, like Emilio de Bono and later Pietro Badoglio, commanded an overwhelming force. The Ethiopian resistance was fiercer than the Italians expected. Warriors fought with incredible courage, but bravery was no match for industrial warfare. The Italian advance was ruthless. They used poison gas, including mustard gas, dropped from airplanes on soldiers and civilians alike. This was a clear violation of the Geneva Protocol, which Italy had signed. Reports from the Red Cross and international observers described horrific scenes of people being blinded, burned, and suffocated. The Italians bombed Red-Crossed hospitals and ambulances, deliberately targeting civilians to break the spirit of the Ethiopian people. The war was not just a conquest. It was a campaign of terror. Faced with this brutal invasion, the League of Nations finally acted. In November 1935, they declared Italy the aggressor and imposed economic sanctions. On the surface, this looked like collective security in action. 50 nations agreed to stop selling arms and certain raw materials to Italy and to deny it loans. It was the first time the League had ever taken such strong measures against a major power. But the sanctions were fatally flawed. They were designed to punish Italy without crippling its war machine or alienating Mussolini too much. Crucially, the sanctions did not include oil. Italy had a modern, mechanized army, and without oil, its tanks, trucks, and planes would grind to a halt. Britain and France argued that an oil embargo might provoke Mussolini into a wider war. Furthermore, the Suez Canal, the vital waterway controlled by Britain and France, remained open to Italian ships. This allowed Mussolini to easily transport troops and supplies from Italy to the front lines. Had the canal been closed, the invasion would have been nearly impossible to sustain. The sanctions were, in effect, a performance. They looked tough, but they were hollow. They were just enough to annoy Mussolini, but not enough to stop him. He later admitted that if the League had imposed an oil embargo, he would have been forced to withdraw his troops within a week. As the Italian army pushed deeper into Ethiopia, Haile Selassie made a final, desperate plea to the world. In May 1936, after the capital Addis Ababa fell, he went into exile. On June 30th, 1936, he stood before the Assembly of the League of Nations in Geneva to deliver one of the most powerful and prophetic speeches of the 20th century. Imagine the scene. A small, dignified emperor, a refugee from his own conquered land, standing before the representatives of the nations that had promised to protect him. He spoke in his native Amharic, his voice filled with a quiet, devastating sorrow. He described in graphic detail the horrors his people were enduring, the chemical weapons, the slaughter of civilians. He asked the assembly, what are they to think of the promises made to them that scorn of treaty pledges would be followed by a joint display of force? He wasn't just pleading for his own country. He was warning the world. He famously said, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." He argued that by abandoning Ethiopia, the League was abandoning its own principles and ensuring its own destruction. If international law could be so easily ignored, then no small nation was safe. His words were met with a mixture of sympathy and unease, but ultimately, no further action was taken. The sanctions against Italy were lifted just a few weeks later. The conquest was a done deal. The League of Nations had been tested, and it had failed. The world had shown that the promises of collective security were empty when they conflicted with the interests of powerful nations. The very appeasement policy meant to contain Hitler by placating Mussolini had backfired spectacularly. Seeing the weakness of the Western democracies, Hitler grew bolder. Just a few months before the invasion of Ethiopia, he had openly violated the Treaty of Versailles by reintroducing military conscription. A few months after the fall of Addis Ababa, he reoccupied the Rhineland. The message was clear: Aggression Pays. The Italo-Ethiopian War was a dress rehearsal for what was to come. It normalized international aggression, shattered the myth of collective security, and pushed Mussolini firmly into an alliance with Hitler, creating the Axis powers that would soon plunge the world into a second, even more devastating global conflict. Haile Selassie's prophecy came true with terrifying speed. The world that had abandoned Ethiopia in 1936 would soon find itself engulfed in the flames of war. But Selassie's story doesn't end there. He would eventually return to his throne in 1941, after British and Commonwealth forces, along with Ethiopian patriots, liberated the country during World War II. His speech remains a powerful reminder of the consequences of inaction and the moral imperative to stand against injustice. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world.